Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thanks for listening today and trusting Grief Refuge as a resource to help navigate your grief and cope with your loss. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Grief Refuge is about helping you find peace and purpose after experiencing a death-related loss. This podcast was created with the intention to help validate everything that you're going through, to take time to reflect, and to honor your loved one. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage grief. You can find comfort, hopefulness, and a sense of peace in regards to your loss, as well as finding a way to embrace life and move forward. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to help you work through the heavier, more painful feelings that go hand in hand with grief. Grief is hard and grief is painful. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything I can to provide the best support to you. Before we begin, I want to mention a couple important points. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and personal reflection. Please use this time to settle in, to relax, and to allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. If anything, please use this time to mourn your loss. Also, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month, and when you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode, and you simply may need more resources. If you're in a place of needing more support, download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app helps provide comfort and support on a daily basis. On the Grief Refuge app, there are daily mini podcasts to help validate your grief, provide perspective, and help you sort through the thoughts and the feelings that come up when dealing with such a significant loss and a significant grief. The Grief Refuge app is easy to find. It's free to download from your phone's app store. Please go ahead and download it now to get started. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Often in grief, the language used to support another is well intended, but it's hard to receive. The language used to communicate is filled with cliches and platitudes that are painful to hear, they're not relatable at all, and they're frequently upsetting to people who are grieving. How can language be used to help grievers be more supported? And how do the supporters learn language that is authentic and helpful? On today's Grief Refuge podcast, I interview and converse with Randi, the author of the book Eddie's Brave Journey and the writer of the popular social media page Grief and Grits. Randi shares more about her ways of navigating lifelong grief and how she writes to help both grievers and supporters of grieving persons. Randi is so kind, and her writing is beyond amazing. Please enjoy our conversation, for it provides more support and deeper understanding for the grief experience. Well, Randi, thanks so much for being a part of Grief Refuge today. We're really grateful you're here.
Thank you, Reed. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I'm going to start off the bat with a compliment because I think you're very talented and gifted at expressing communications of the heart, and specifically with the grief experience. I love looking at what you post too. I find it on Instagram. I know you post in other places too, but Instagram is really where I find it the easiest and most conveniently. And it just really, I find so much comfort when I read something that you share, and I just want to appreciate you for that.
Oh, thank you. That fills my heart. Thank you. That really means the world to me.
Well, Randi, one of the things that I was thinking about in the work that you do is that you identify yourself as a grief educator. And it's such an important title, but yet it can have so many different meanings for whomever takes on that title. Can you share a little bit more about what being a grief educator means for you?
Yeah, and I agree. It sounds like, well, what the heck does that mean? And I've actually been asked that question before, because I don't know that it's actually a real title, but it's one that I've given myself, because what I try to do in my writing, through my writing on Grief and Grits, is to educate about grief. And my education that I provide is based on my own experience as a griever from the age of 10 when my dad died. And that's, that's a lifetime of experience that is my experience, but I'm always hopeful that something that I have to say will maybe touch another person's heart and resonate in some way. It doesn't have to, but I hope it does. And then, having worked professionally in the field of grief, just what I've learned through about 13 years of experience that way. So combining those two, I hope, is a sense of education. And that's how I came to the title Grief Educator.
Are you familiar with the teacher's square? Do you know about that concept?
No, I don't think I do.
So I actually don't know it in full context, but like it's palm reading. Like on the hand, there's some kind of X or something on people's hands, and they call it the teacher's square. And basically, I was wondering, if you ever had your palm read, someone might have pointed out that you have the teacher's square on your hand, because I hear it in almost like the essence of what you're trying to say. It's not just like what you're saying, Randi, but it's how you're saying it. I'm like, she is such a teacher at heart. Have you had teaching experience in the past, in addition to the grief education, of course?
But it's funny. I thought I wanted to be a school teacher because my dad was a school teacher, and so I think I spent most of my life thinking that that is what I would do. And when I got to college, I ended up taking a different path and ended up going to school to become a marriage and family therapist. And I don't practice anymore. That was a long time ago. But I ended up being a teacher of sorts when I started working in the field of grief and going out and teaching publicly, working with students and teachers and therapists. And so it always kind of amazed me that it took me many years to finally come to where I thought I had wanted to come early on, to honor my dad. And so I appreciate you saying that, because it makes me feel connected to my dad somehow.
That's really beautiful and very interesting. Yeah. Connecting the dots is always hard to do. And then sometimes, in hindsight, looking back, it's like, oh, okay, I can see how I got to where I am now through all the experiences and all the types of things that I've done, and things that had happened in your life, meaningful events and significant events, and then the intention of staying connected to your father. It's really beautiful, Randi. So writing is such an important thing in the education that you provide. And it's such a strong means of communication, especially if shared on social media. Can you share perhaps story, or help us understand how you got into writing about grief?
Yeah, actually, I stumbled my way in, to be honest with you. I had left my job about 4.5 years ago that was in the field of grief. And I thought, gosh, I feel like I still want to address grief. I want to use, like I said earlier, the experience that I had as a bereaved child, and being a lifetime griever, and the experience that I had working in the profession, and thought, how can I still kind of impart the things that I've learned? And I thought, well, I'll, try a Facebook page, and came up with the name Grief and Grits. Don't know why, other than it just sounded kind of fun to me. And it made sense for me somehow that, grief, we need comfort food like grits, and we need grit, to kind of move our way through this thing called grief. And so I came up with the name and started writing, and hoped that by the end of that year, it was August, I hope by the end of December, that if 50 people followed along, I'd keep going. And somehow, people found me, or I found them somehow. And I think that November, I decided to try Instagram also. And especially more so on Instagram than Facebook, I stumbled onto this grief community that I was so surprised was out there. I had no idea, and just kept writing and connecting, and so it's just been such a wonderful experience, really, to connect with grievers, to connect with other people who are, really trying hard to educate and just make sure that grief is present. So ironically, of course, over these last 2 years, I think grief has never been more present with the pandemic. So that's really how I started writing. And sometimes I don't even know myself where the words come from. It's a strange and wonderful experience, really.
Is there one typical place you tend to come up with your writings? Like perhaps some kind of sanctuary? I'm tapping into something that maybe, for lack of a better word, inspired by that desire to stay connected to your dad.
Yeah, absolutely. But as far as where I come up with ideas, you don't even want to know. It can be driving in the car. I've had to pull over so I can write something down because it just came to me. It can be in the shower. It can be just, sitting on my sofa. Sometimes at night, something will come to me. So I have no rhyme or reason to how I do my writing. It really is mostly spontaneous, although sometimes I'll just come up with an idea, I write it down, and the whole post won't come to me for even maybe a couple of weeks or days. Sometimes they come out really quickly. So there really is no rhyme or reason to it for me.
Is there any self-induced or outside pressures to have stuff written consistently or as frequent as you publish?
No, I think it's more, for me, it's just when it comes to me, I'll write it and publish it. It's just so enjoyable for me. I love to hear what people have to say or how they respond. And so it really is there. Like I said, there's really no rhyme or reason. It's kind of when it just comes and hits, and I'll post it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's easy to project onto your experience of how it's a creative process that can help be mourning too. I don't know if it resonates. I apologize if it doesn't, but I just think of like writing as such a way, a comfortable way to express one's inner thoughts and one's feelings related to grief, and that expression of it is arguably mourning. Mourning isn't just crying. Mourning is other ways of expressing grief too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And mourning needs to happen in order to experience healing. So it's interesting with the age of social media, and if there are people that are commenting or they're doing something to show what we call engagement on social media, it's really interesting to almost look at that as like, that's possible that could be that person's expression of their grief too. They're mourning in some way in a digital age. I don't want to proclaim any judgment on it. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I don't know if it's better or worse. It's just really interesting because it's unique, and everybody's grief experience and their mourning experience is unique.
I agree with you. I think that my page and all the different pages that are out there, give people an opportunity to express in a way that they may not have somebody at home that they can talk to or reach out to. And I think that for all the negatives that we hear about social media in the grief world, I think it's extremely positive. I think there's a lot of healing that happens through all these grief pages, I because people need to see themselves and need to know that they're not alone in the things that they're feeling. Because grief is a very universal experience. As lonely and as individual as it is, it's also a very universal experience. So I think that, uh, you know, when my dad died, it was 1966. There wasn't even one book for a child to read. There wasn't one book for my mom, who was a 35-year-old widow, to read. She went to the library and found a book on what to do with your finances now that you're a widow. That was it. So nothing brings me as much joy as knowing that now, there's so many places to read and talk and share. It's incredible.
Hmm. Yeah, we've really evolved
We
as a
really have.
species.
Yeah. And even with that, though, isn't it amazing how difficult it still is to talk about grief?
So true. Yes, indeed. Randi, coming back to your writing, you've published a children's book, Grieving the Loss of a Loved One. The book is called Eddie's Brave Journey. The main character is Eddie the elephant. Can you share more about your creative process and how the creation of these characters and the story unfolded for you?
Yeah. Again, I was I had been into writing Grief and Grits for maybe about 4 or 5 months, maybe a little more than that. And I was sitting on my sofa one day, and this little elephant just popped into my head, and I thought, "Ooh, that sounds like it could be a children's grief book." And it all kind of unfolded really within that moment. This little elephant who was grieving the death of his grandpa, and he had to figure out what to do with all of his great big feelings. And at first I thought he would go all around the world to meet other animals, but he ended up staying kind of in his own backyard. And and I knew that I wanted to address certain things for children, that they go through and feel, and ways to help the adults who would be reading the book to the child engage and help start conversation. And so there is a little character in my book called Solly Squirrel, and Solly is Eddie the elephant's best friend. Solly is named for my dad, by the way, who was Sol, and his nickname was Solly. And Solly is not only Eddie's best friend, but he's a teacher. And so the character of Solly engages with the reader to ask certain questions. It helps the parent or the caregiver that's reading the book ask questions that they might not know how to ask or be afraid to ask. And so Eddie meets other animals that help him with these great big feelings until he comes to the end of his journey, and he's very tired and he's ready to go home because he's learned all about his great big feelings. And I the couple of things that are really important to me about this book are, one, the language that I use is what I like to call real language. No euphemisms. I use the word died. I explain what that means, that the body has stopped working, because children need to hear that language. As much as we think it's helpful and comforting to use euphemisms, children are very literal. And so they need to hear the real word and be explained what that means. And so I hope that what my book offers is the comfort for the parent or caregiver reading the book to be able to use that language. I also don't use any language around religion, because I want each family to be able to bring what their own culture, religion, beliefs are into, reading the book with their own child.
Thanks, Randy. As I read the book, I tapped in with my 4-year-old self and felt comforted. And I thought, if anything, it's really a safe container for because children who are often so curious can further explore with whomever is the adult that is likely reading the story to them. And so I'm deeply grateful for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I love how you put that the book is like a container. That's really lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks to you because you're the one who created it. And I also want to give props to your illustrator because it's really colorful, it's vibrant, and it's very inviting for a child to, keep their eyes on the page. It's really exploratory too. And
Yeah. I love the illustrations too so much. And what I love about the illustrations, besides the fact that they're just so beautiful and kind of jump off the page, is we can put a child on our lap at 1 years old to read a book and start a conversation about death. Just going through the pretty pages, and we can start talking to a child at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years about the concepts and have these pretty pages to look at. And animals are so engaging, and the book is written in rhyme because I think rhyme makes it a little bit more palatable to take in a subject like death and grief. So yeah, I feel like the book is really something that can be read from 0 to 99.
absolutely. And then if you're up for a spoiler alert, will there be any more brave journeys that Eddie will take?
Gosh, I think about that a lot. I'm not sure. I love Eddie so much. I just, he's like my little baby. He really, and Solly Squirrel. And I think about it a lot. So I don't know yet. I hope so.
Honest answer, always appreciative. Coming back to your perspective, Randy, on the grief experience. So, a lot of grievers deal with a lot of cliches, a lot of platitudes, and other things that actually really disenfranchise their grief journey. And so, I'm just curious, do you have hopes? Do you have wishes for people and then also their support networks that are going through what is often hurtful and isolating?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of the posts that I do is I try to provide language that can be helpful for supporters, as you say. Um, I think that a lot of times, like you said, grievers feel disenfranchised because they hear so many platitudes and things that are not helpful. And yet I feel for supporters too, because a lot of times they don't know what to say and they're trying their very best. Um, and so I think it's education that's twofold. It's education to help grievers, but it's also education to help supporters so that they can know what's right to say and what can be helpful to say. And I think a lot about, we hear a lot on grief pages and in grief writing, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. And that is true, absolutely. But what does that mean? If we don't know kind of what's right and what's wrong and what's, what are ways to address our grief? I think we need that education also. So I think for me, it's about helping, like I said, both grievers and supporters gain language, gain boundaries, gain ways to, be able to express not only as a griever what I need, but as a supporter to know what to offer and how to be there for someone.
Mm, very well said. I often think about in school settings, whether it's public, private, or any type, and any ages. How great would it be to have a subject of like just something called life experiences, where grief and things about relationships and everything kind of that we learn as we live, but we don't necessarily have platforms or places to communicate such things.
Yes, absolutely. And especially in the school setting, and there's so many opportunities to be able to talk about death and grief in a school setting. And, but so many times teachers, even medical professionals, just haven't been given the language and the skills and the tools to be able to do that.
Randi, another big takeaway coming back to Eddie's Brave Journey is that I really thought if there's an essence for me here, and if I were to read this story to anyone, it's really about exploring and then understanding what is referred to as the big feelings in grief. And I think that's beautifully stated for a children's experience. And I thought, well, what about adults too? So I'm curious, what do you hope that adults come across when they see you and read your work, and about understanding the big feelings in their own grief?
Well, one of the things that's very important for me to hopefully get across is that grief is a lifelong journey, pursuit, activity. It's not something that we should never be looking to get over grief. And I want people to really understand that we carry grief throughout our life. And that if we can understand that, if we can understand the different ways that it will show itself throughout our life, that we can prepare for that. We can understand it, even if we can't always prepare for the feelings that may hit us, but we can have understanding and compassion for ourselves, and to know that that is what grief does. It comes to visit again, over and over, and that's okay. And I'm a 56-year long griever, and I like people to know that I yearn for my dad and I miss my dad. And there are moments where it hurts in indescribable ways that I don't have him, and how much he's missed of my life, and how much of life that he has missed. But if you don't understand that, if you don't know that grief comes along with you throughout your life, it can feel so scary. And how can you have compassion for yourself if you don't understand that that's a part of it? So I think that's the biggest thing, and my biggest goal on Grief and Grits is for people to understand that and be able to hold that gently.
I think it's amazing to articulate it in such a way and fashion as that. And there's really pretty much nothing I can say to it to contribute. I just want to end the podcast here. And so thank you, Randi, because that was very insightful and very wise and very helpful in articulating how much grief impacts our lives and for the duration that it does.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So your work, it's impacted thousands of people, perhaps even more. And in ways, it's provided support and comfort to them. For your own process of writing and sharing what you compose, how has it supported you, Randi?
I think that the biggest surprise for me of all in writing this page, Grief and Grits, and writing Eddie's Brave Journey, has been the ways that it allows me to feel connected to my dad. Every single day, through the words that I share and the words that I get back, the feedback that I get back, knowing that Eddie's Brave Journey is in the hands of little grievers, and the connection there with Solly Squirrel, and to my own grief as a child, because Eddie comes definitely from my 10-year-old heart as well as my adult, but definitely from my 10-year-old. And so I think that that has been the way it supports me.
Fantastic. Well, we thank you for sharing your heart. We thank you for sharing your experience and sharing your father, sharing everything about this sacred connection that you have to your father. I also deeply respect that. To me, it sounds like you look for ways to maintain the relationship and to nurture the relationship, despite your father, Saul, not being here in physical form. And I deeply respect that. That is something that I strive to do with my biological father too. And I also think that there's a lot of expectations for people to quote unquote move on after they lose a loved one that they care so deeply about. And then in grief education, a lot of people say honor the memory. Well, yes, honor the memory, but you can also honor the relationship and nurture it going forward. It just takes some creativity, and we see that as an example from your work. So, Randi, thanks for being a part of Grief Refuge, and thanks for sharing pieces of you today.
Thank you, Reed. This was a wonderful interview. Thank you for your very tender and kind heart. And it was really an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and all the stories and the experiences shared here on this podcast. Grief and healing, it's important work. And although it's painful at times, it's so worth it for helping to heal your heart, your mind, and your soul. Remember that if you need more grief support, download the Grief Refuge app. It's a daily companion that is made to comfort and support you through this difficult journey. Please search Grief Refuge on your phone's app store now. Also, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback is deeply valued and it's listened to. We want the Grief Refuge podcast to best serve your needs. And the more you let us know, the better we can provide. Please rate and review the Grief Refuge podcast on your favorite podcast player. Thank you. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Keep listening to your heart. Be kind to yourself and talk to you soon.